The Soul is Not a Smithy by David Foster Wallace, Part 5. Later, Mr. DeMatteis was forced out of the wholesale newspaper delivery trade by what Chris DeMatteis said were elements of organized crime that were moving down from Cleveland and taking over all newspaper and coin-operated vending machine businesses in the state, forcing Mr. DeMatteis to take a job as a taxi dispatcher. But at least Chris stopped having to get up so early that he could not stay awake in his classes, and later discovered a natural talent for manual machine operation in Mr. Vaughn's industrial arts class at Fishinger, and is now a shop steward at Precision Tool and Die, only a few blocks from my own firm's offices. In the midst of writing on the chalkboard, illustrating that the phrase due process of law appears identically in both the Fifth and 14th Amendments, Meister Richard Allen Johnson inadvertently inserted something else in the phrase as well, the capital word kill. Ellen Morrison, Sanjay Rabindranath, and some other of the class's more diligent pupils, copying down word for word what Mr. Johnson was putting up on the chalkboard, discovered that they had written due process kill of law, and that too was what was on the chalkboard, which Mr. Johnson had stepped one or two steps back from and was looking up in evident puzzlement at what was written there. At least, many classmates later reported this as puzzlement because of the way, even though the sub was facing the chalkboard and thus had his back to the class, his head was now cocked curiously over to the side, not unlike a dog's when it hears a certain type of sound, and he remained that way for a moment before shaking his head slightly, as if shaking off some confusion and, using the board's eraser to erase the kill of law, replaced it with the corrective law. As usual, Chris DeMatteis had his head on his desk in the second row and was asleep because his father and older brothers ran a newspaper delivery service for newsstands and retail vendors, covering over a third of the city early in the morning. And often they made DeMatteis get up as early as 3 o'clock in the morning to pitch in and help, even if it was a school day. And DeMatteis often fell asleep in his classes, especially if it was a sub. Mandy Blem, who most of the other children at R.B. Hayes knew very little about in terms of the realities of her personal life or history. Both I and Tim Applewhite had been in Miss Clennan's slow readers class with Blem in 3rd grade. Applewhite later got bused to a special school in Minerva Park as he just could not read at all. He really was a slow reader, whereas Blem and I were not. Rarely ever even took her book or pencils out in class, and always sat looking at the desktop in a withdrawn or sullen manner, and never paid attention or ever completed any of her assignments until the school authorities reached a point where they became so concerned that they began making plans to have Blem transferred to Minerva Park as well, at which time she would abruptly begin completing her assignments and being involved in classroom goings-on. Then, as soon as the administrative heat was off, she would once more revert to sitting staring at her desktop or biting dead skin off of the sides of her thumbnail very slowly for the whole class period. She had also been known to eat paste. Everyone was a little afraid of her. At the same time, Frankie Caldwell, who now works in Dayton as a quality control inspector for Union Royale, had his head down and was drawing something on his theme paper with great precision and intensity. Allison Standish, who later moved away, was absent again. Meanwhile, the Eighth Amendment, the first IICEX, or what comprised the familiar Bill of Rights, although the Eighth Amendment was adopted simultaneously in 1791, contains the phrase, "the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states," and so forth, which Mr. Johnson, while at the board, according to Ellen Morrison and every other pupil taking notes, wrote as, "the power not delegated kill to the United States them by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it kill them to the states," at which time there was again evidently another long classroom silence, during which the pupils all began looking at one another, while Mr. Johnson stood with his back to the room at the board, with his hand with the yellow chalk hanging at his side, and his head again cocked to the side, as if he were having trouble hearing or understanding something, without turning around or saying anything, before picking up the board's eraser once again and trying to continue the lesson on Amendments X and Tortured as though nothing unusual had taken place. According to Mandy Blem, by this time the room was deathly quiet, and many of the pupils had an uneasy expression on their face as they dutifully crossed out the them and kill them that Mr. Johnson had initially inserted in the quotation. At this same time in the window, a terrible series of events were transpiring for Ruth Simmons's father, who in a diagonal series of panels in the protective mesh was stoically and uncomplainingly clearing the long black driveway of snow with the enormous Snow Boy brand device that the owner's company engineers had invented in his R&D laboratories, which was why he was now so wealthy. This was just the beginning of the era of power lawnmowers and snow removers for ordinary consumers. Meanwhile, Mrs. Marjorie Simmons's car was stuck in the street's heavy snow and was idling with the windows so steamed up that the observer had no idea what she might be doing in there. And Cuffy and the hard-bitten feral dogs were presumably still traversing the lengthy industrial pipe that ran from the Scioto River to a large industrial chemical factory on Olentangy River Road. As for several consecutive panels, there are depictions of the cement exterior of the pipe, but no visible activity or anything exiting the pipe at either end, except for the ominous orange trickle into the river. The whole civics classroom had become very quiet. The total number of words on the chalkboard after the erasures was either 104 or 121, depending on whether one counted Roman numerals as words or not. If asked, I could probably have told you the total number of letters, the most and least used letters, in this case a tie, as well as a number of different statistical functions by which the relative frequency of different letters' appearance could be quantified. Although I would not have put any of these facts in this way, nor was I even quite aware that I could. The facts about the words were simply there, much the way a knowledge of how your tummy feels and where your arms are there regardless of whether you're paying attention to these parts or not. They were simply part of the peripheral environment in which I sat. What I was, however, wholly aware of was that I was becoming more and more disturbed by the graphic narrative that was unfolding, square by square, in the window. While dramatic and diverting, few of the window's narratives were ever gruesome or unpleasant. Most had upbeat, if somewhat naive and childish, themes. And it was only on days when there was enough time before the bell rang for the end of civics that I got to see how they ended. Some carried over from the prior day, but as a practical matter this was rare, as it was difficult to hold all the unfolding details in mind for that long.